Monitoring Center, now the FRA, and the OSCE Berlin Declaration of 2004. And the points that I wanted to make was that anti-Semitism, terrorism nexus, what I would call anti-Semitic identity theft, third, anti-Semitic indifference, and fourth, anti-Semitism as a threat to world peace. Now, I will try to reduce what I have to say here. I think for many of us, Durban was the turning point. But there was a few, and those were the Pretcons. In those Pretcons, I remember in Geneva, and the proof is, I just left the room, on the ISIS. I was sitting at that Pretcon, and the legal counsel to the Palestinian NGOs came up behind me, and she whispered, sweet nothings in my ear, she said, "Give us Palestine, we'll give you the Holocaust." And my face told it all, because Ronnie took a photograph, he couldn't hear what was said, but he certainly saw the impact, the effect. And I thought that that sort of set a line. All Jews were excluded from the last of those Pretcons in Tehran. When we got to Durban, things had changed, all the efforts that would be put into it, and it was like the Passover Haggadah. Who knows three, who knows two? There were three Holocausts, there was the transatlantic slave trade, continuing trafficking, and the Nakba. Who knows two anti-Semitisms. Those against Jews until 45, with the victory of Zionism against the other side. And using Orwellian doublespeak, so if anti-Semitism is Arabophobia, Zionism is anti-Semitism. And here began something that I thought of was identity theft. In fact, Durban didn't finish when we all left. Durban finished, in a way, on the 6th of December, the last meeting of the TEPCONs, the International Steering Committee, where a document was circulated, 8 points. And those 8 points, the document was denied, DNA was denied generally. However, it was based on the Sullivan program to bring down the apartheid South African regime. And it was through the media, it was education, it was legal measures, it was economic boycott, it was sports, trade, cultural boycotts, embargoes, everything we've been living. Diplomatic ruptures, and finally the last day of the points was the penalties for states and NGOs that do not follow the demands. And it was continued through the vector of the World Social Forum born in Porto Alegre in 2003. Standing in that stadium with about 70,000 young people screaming "Viva la Intifada Global," and very bizarre banners like Nazis, Yankees, Jews, no more chosen peoples, one felt very much alone. And we continue to go to the World Social Forum, and some of us to the European Satellite, the European Social Forum, which continues that campaign, particularly based on BDS. Now, BDS, we all know what it is, but just before that, I would suggest that there's been, like, in a way, with theological supersessionism, the replacement theology, when Israel Monikali said in Spiritum, the church said, we are the true Israel. Today, that is happening to our narrative, the key word we just saw up there. And we can track a concerted identity there. First, this application of the apartheid canard from South African history, BDS. In France, where I had my office, BDS stormtroopers in green uniform stormed the Grand Surface, the supermarkets. They go straight to the kosher shelves. They pack the trolleys. They rush past intimidated cashiers. They burn them. And I mean, you can't blame French Jews who begin to think of Kaufmann by Newton and what this meant then. So now there are some legal measures. We were involved in some of those legal measures against these boycott anti-Semites. Next stage is the theft of Jewish heritage. In July in St. Petersburg at the World Heritage Committee of UNESCO, there was a campaign, and certainly manipulated by Palestine, for the heritage of the Bethlehem and the Church of the Nativity. Fine, I don't think that bothers any of us. But they have a hefty appetite. And the appetite includes now Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, I came here from the Frankfurt Book Fair, and at the book fair I found a book which is called The Borat War. Some of you may know who was Borat, what was Borat. And Muhammad flew from, on his winged steed from Mecca, Shemaima, to heaven. Didn't have direct flights then, he went through Jerusalem, stopped at the wall, tethered the mount, came back. Now it's the Borat War, and this book sets out a whole program to mythologize this campaign by the Jews to take Muslim heritage. Next step was in the religious field. We've seen, for example, in the Kairos document, we've seen in the Eastern churches. Now it's beginning also in some of the Protestant, Pentecostalist, Methodist, etc. Such terms, chosen people, promised land. These are arguably violations of human rights. So, but the most egregious has nothing to do with the Middle East, and that's here. And that is the so-called Prague Declaration, the conflation between the Holocaust genocide, Stalinist genocide, a whitewash of those collaborators by saying the Jews were so involved in commissars that sent to the Gulag, the collaborators, and a homogenization whereby, for example, January 27th, the United Nations recognized that the Holocaust should be replaced, the European Parliament should be replaced by August 23rd, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, when all this conflation comes together. That, in again, is a form of ID theft. Now, I'm going to cut out a lot here because I think that I was going to talk about the decoupling of the Holocaust today in the way that it is treated from the Jewish victim. And I think we all know about it. The anthropologization of the Holocaust in the sense that, well, if you take anti-racist organizations in Europe, their great icon is Kristallnacht. But if you take Kristallnacht, in the year 2000, when the Intifada began, there was mourning for the burning synagogues of 1938 and nothing for the burning synagogues of 2000. And that type of decoupling, I believe, is a very dangerous new way of taking out the Jew from his history. Is Matthias Kunzel still here? Yeah. Matthias came to a seminar that we organized at the British Parliament for the 70th anniversary of the Wannsee Protocol. And the focus was not the 6 million, the deed, but the other 5 million, the intent, the 11 million from the protocol. Matthias brought a fascinating document signed by Eichmann regarding the fate of Iranian Jewry. We also brought in another book which was ostensibly ordered by Hitler, the demographic sociology of the Jews of North America, which has horrifying implications. It talks about Jewish communities from Peabody, Massachusetts, all the way down to Arizona, and it's stamped with the eagle, the swastika. The point I'm making here is that the universality of the Holocaust, but particularly to Jews. Durban II at the UN in Geneva coincided with Yom HaShoah. And who was the only head of state that spoke? Ahmadinejad. Ahmadinejad, if you remember, his message was memoricide. It was to kill the memory of those that were killed. It was to say the Holocaust is a lie, let's make it a reality. So, outside the UN gate, some of you may have been there, under the famous chair with the missing leg in memory of the victims of landmines, Elie Wiesel addressed some 3,000 people, including many survivors. And he said the following: in the ghettos before deportation, we married, we had children, we had hope. In the Allied internment camps after liberation from Auschwitz, we married, we had children, we had hope. Today, here in Geneva, hope died for our generation and for the generation of our children. So what am I doing here? Why am I reading? As Albert Camus wrote, where there is no hope, it must be reinvented, at least for our grandchildren. And I think most people sitting there had goosebumps. Now, I come to that third point. That is the anti-Semitism and indifference. And I'm sure that we are all beginning to experience. I was invited by BBC World Service to go host a program on the number of incidents after a cast lecture. And I said, it's going to be another Israel bashing program? No, no way. And it was together with the Muslim University, I think it was exactly, but and the course came in, and the courses were fielded, and they were all, oh, so, you know, after cast letter, you were more anti-Israel than you were before. But the indifference to the issue of the incidents of anti-Semitism after cast letter, which was the purpose for which I was invited to that program, was very clear, and finally, after about 20 minutes, I told them now time to goodbye. So, Ahmadinejad, he said the Holocaust is a lie, and there was a wave of outrage. He said a little later, wipe Israel off the map, there was more muted reactions. He said Jews are basilic, humor, vermin, and there was a sort of a painful silence. Was it Jew fatigue? Was it anesthetization of pain, of opinion? Was it numbing effect? By raising the bar, he's probing the limits of Western timidity. It's good old appeasement, it's feeding the crocodile in order to be eaten last.
In contrast to Durban 1, in Durban 2, when it's all, some delegations left.
Yes,
And
it's
some
true.
did not even enter.
It's true. It's true. Yeah. But some didn't leave because of him. I'll be very happy to tell you which didn't leave because of him. But anyway, they did. It looked. So, a leitmotif of our discussions has been the relationship between particularism and universalism. It's been going on for years on the relation between Holocaust and genocide, but here it was raised, I think it was by Dina, the relationship between anti-Semitism and racism. Universalism and particularism. And this is this is an aphorism which I think it was Hank Knight, the Holocaust historian, said. The Holocaust is never not Jewish, but it is always more than Jewish. And I think it's a very telling phrase. I was invited not too long ago to go to Halabja, Iraqi Kurdistan, together with some lawyers who are working on the companies that provide the precursors of the poison gas that Saddam used and in one day killed 5,000 and wounded 27. And it was really quite an experience standing there. And I said to the audience of Kurdish television, here on the Iranian border, here the Jews in their exile from their own land were born, the Babylonian time. And in it there is an ethical message, if I'm not for myself who will be, but above all, this is conditioned by, if I'm only for myself, what am I? And we're here for you. And we're in the process of trying to get this 24 years ago, those who had 10% in validity, today have 80% in validity, so we've already set up some hospitals in the West to receive them. And obviously it shows us in a good light, Jews, and it is also doing some good. So I think that it's something that is work. In the year 2000, the millennium, I believe, and I'm sure a lot of us believe, that the world Jewry was moving from admission to acceptance. Normalization of a people that dwells alone, a saving remnant to a light unto the nations. Didn't happen. Was not to be. Only one state in the 195 member states of the UN is truly facing existential threats, extinction. And I'd like to end by quoting from Alvin Rosenfeld's The End of the Holocaust, where he cites the post-Zionist and recanted post-Zionist Betty Morris. The Nazis industrialized mass murder, but still had one-on-one contact with the victims. Roundup, mow-down, transport, gas, burn bodies, etc. The second Holocaust will be different. One bright morning, 5 or 10 years after Iran's acquisition of the bomb, perhaps in a regional crisis, perhaps out of the blue, the mullahs in secret session in Qom will order Shahab 3 and Shahab 4 nuclear-tipped missiles to Tel Aviv, Haifa, Beersheba, probably not Jerusalem. Two cosmological implications of the destruction of the lifestyle. But target Israel's defense bases. He continues, only 3 or 4 hits, 1 million immediate deaths, survivor millions irradiated. And all Iranians need, no Iranian needs to touch an Israeli. Quite impressive. Well, Holocaust memory should have been a bulwark against renewed anti-Semitism. and the ultimate anti-Semitism. It hasn't happened. And I quote Imre Kertész. Since Auschwitz, nothing has happened to make a new Auschwitz impossible. This is Kertész. As it once occurred, no one can say it cannot happen again. Mass murder in Bosnia, Rwanda, Sri Lanka, Darfur, and today I have Syria, are met with almost totally different. So why not accept them? Sure. So, just to end on that note, we have particulars. I don't know if any of you remember that old film, The Day After, after the thermonuclear war. The joke going around at that time, and I'm old enough to remember it, was the ultimate anti-Semitism would be that the survivors remember the names of Einstein, Oppenheimer, Taylor. But we like to be universalists. So just as a final example of an experience I went through that I would never ever do again. September of last year, I and my colleague visited 10 countries in 11 days. Indeed, there were Caribbean islands and 3 Central American countries. The flying time was between 10 and 20 minutes. But still, the idea was to show the leaders of those countries, on the basis of the fact that each Caribbean island had the same power as China, 1 vote in the General Assembly, the plans of Iran for the construction of Shahab 3 missile base on the Venezuelan coast facing Eastern Arabia. Who is in the line of fire? Caribbean islands. Of course, they have 2,500 miles range, so they can also hit Tampa, Florida, but doesn't seem to bother the Iran administration. However, that for me is an irony, because certainly they responded in a very interesting way. So Dickie Belize, diplomatic Belize, the foreign minister, he turned it the other way around, and you look through it, and he said, now you see that the Caribbean should be here, it's not here, now a line of demarcation, because this is a war with Guatemala, is here, and that is your green line, and that is the Mediterranean. You really think we're going to vote in the UN for any type of resolution which frees frontiers without negotiation? So, I know that a lot of people use the word Auschwitz lines. It comes from the late Albert Everett. I don't like the term. I'm sure that many here don't like the term. But Auschwitz is indeed a warning. And whether you look in the mirror of particularism or you look out the window of universalism, whether it's in the Caribbean or whether it is in the Arab Gulf, Simon Wiesenthal had a great expression. What starts with the Jews never ends with the Jews. It always leads to a general scourge. Thank you.
I'm going to stand because it's going to encourage brevity. Much of my work nowadays is at the diplomatic level, and I want to focus on the work of the international agencies. 3 European agencies address the issue of anti-Semitism according to their specific roles and in their own ways, although there is some degree of overlap between them. I'm concentrating on them rather than the United Nations and UNESCO, as combating anti-Semitism occupies a comparatively more important role in their work. I'm not going to go through a lot of the history which I had originally written in this paper because we don't have the time. So I'll start with the 2003 meeting in Vienna, organised by the OSCE, which is the first high-level conference addressed specifically to the issue of anti-Semitism, and attended by more than 400 participants, including foreign ministers and world Jewish leaders. It became clear during the proceedings that a further meeting to focus on practical solutions would be required as participants came to realise that anti-Semitism was now coming from new and different directions. Several of the keynote speakers, including French former Foreign Minister Robert Badinter, Erwin Kotler, then a member of the Canadian Parliament, and shortly to be appointed Justice Minister, and Robert Wistrich, stressed that the new anti-Semitism, which demonises Israel, has the potential to be every bit as genocidal as that of the Nazis. Badinter, in particular, noted that the number of incidents recorded each year during the 1990s had never exceeded 20 a year, but that they exploded in 2000 with 119 recorded incidents. Of these, 114 occurred after 28th November and the outbreak of the Second Intifada. Kochler added that the new anti-Semitism is frequently transmitted in the internet, as we've heard, and that while traditional anti-Semitism is addressed to individual Jews or the Jewish religion, the new anti-Semitism addresses Israel, the collective Jew amongst the nations. That was followed by the Berlin Conference in April 2004, hosted by the German Federal President, Hans Rau. The final conference declaration stated, I quote, unambiguously that international developments on political issues, including those in Israel and elsewhere in the Middle East, never justify anti-Semitism. While not as strong as some would have wished, it nevertheless broke a logjam in pointing to the source of much contemporary anti-Semitism, that from the Muslim world and the left, and which hides itself in the language of human rights. Equally importantly, it committed participating states to collect and maintain data on anti-Semitism and other hate crimes, and to work with the Parliamentary Assembly to determine appropriate means for periodic review of the problem. The OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, ODIHR, you have to understand the OSCE proceeds by acronyms. I'm not going to throw too many at you, but it's bewildering for an outsider. ODIHR was tasked with systematic collection and publication of information and identifying best practice in order to advise states on countering anti-Semitism. The Berlin Declaration was subsequently endorsed by the OSCE Permanent and Ministerial Councils, thereby obliging participating states to follow the recommendations. That's important, and I'll come back to that in a minute. This marked the first practical step by governments towards recognising the importance of anti-Semitism and dealing with it, and it was reflected in the following year's statement by the UN General Secretary, Kofi Annan. Berlin was followed by other high-level conferences, and I'll skip through those and what they decided. But important to note that these are ongoing initiatives with regular reviews requiring governments to report their progress. Although this process began with the realisation that anti-Semitism was once again growing and that it's often fuelled by the overspill of Middle East tension and the penetration of Islam-Islamic ideologies, it's broadened to encompass all forms of racism and hate crime. In parallel with the OSCE, the agencies of the European Union are also making progress, although their initiatives were also hampered in the early days by the misplaced perception that anti-Semitism only comes from the extreme right. I won't amplify this, I have it in my text, but both of these issues have been referred to by previous speakers. In 2002, the EUMC, which was the monitoring centre of the European Commission, commissioned 15 national focal points of its racism and xenophobia network, the RAXIM network, to collect data on anti-Semitism within the European Union. It also commissioned a separate report from Berlin University to analyse the reports and publish a composite analysis. The result was not well received by the EUMC board, and again we've heard that in the last couple of days, allegedly because it apportioned much of the blame for rising anti-Semitism on Europe's Muslim communities, and a clumsy attempt was made to suppress the report. When they commissioned the second report, it confirmed the findings of the first, and the final composited report, Manifestations of Anti-Semitism in the EU, 2000-2003, finally acknowledged this point, that increasingly anti-Semitism arises as a consequence of tension in the Middle East and the spillover of that, and that anti-Semitism is coming from new and different directions. It also, the EUMC, also called for regular monitoring and a proper workable definition of anti-Semitism for the post-Shoah era, when anti-Zionism sometimes cloaks hatred of Jews. That's an important point for all of those who say, why does FRA not adopt the EUMC working definition? When the EUMC was wound up and FRA was established, it was established with a different mandate to that of EUMC. It's not, as the EUMC was, a separate self-tasked agency. It is an agency that is tasked by the European Commission and specifically to follow up the human dimension of the Lisbon Treaty, which has a much wider range of interests. And so the FRA is not an agency which sets its own tasking. It's not able to adopt things in the way the EUMC was, and this is the reason why it's not adopted the working definition. But more of that later. So, FRA has a different focus. It's much wider than that of the EUMC, but monitoring anti-Semitism remains part of its core business. It's in the programming. It's because I'm a member of the Oversight Committee of Fundamental Rights Agency. I see the programs going forward, which you wouldn't see online, and it remains and will remain part of its core business for the foreseeable future. Although it deals with a much, much wider range of problems than just anti-Semitism. And in this regard, FRA is engaged in 3 substantial projects on anti-Semitism. The first is the annual report, drawn from data provided by government and civil society organisations. And the second is the survey of Jews' experiences and perceptions of anti-Semitism in 9 EU member states. This will be amongst the largest surveys of anti-Semitism ever undertaken, and it will be published probably around mid-2013. The third is a study on the role that memorials, commemoration sites, and historical exhibitions play in Shoah and human rights education, detailed in a handbook for teachers on using visits to Holocaust-related sites and exhibitions to best effect, and a handbook on best practices for Shoah memorial sites. Let me turn now to the Council of Europe, which is the oldest European institution. COE seeks to develop democratic and legal norms, common responses to political, social and legal challenges, and to monitor adherence to the European Convention on Human Rights. Its monitoring body, ECRI, the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, publishes regular reviews, 4-yearly reviews, of each member state of the Council of Europe adherence to the European Convention, and it criticises those states which are not dealing adequately, which are not updating their legislation, which are not putting in place legislation. Moreover, it also publishes policy recommendations, which are advisories to governments, and has published one, in fact it was number 9, on the fight against anti-Semitism from 2004, which recommends that member states prioritise fighting anti-Semitism by enacting legislation and a whole host of other things. It also requires, the Council of Europe requires member states to establish and support national specialised bodies to monitor racism, xenophobia and anti-Semitism, to introduce anti-racist education into school curricula, promote learning about Jewish history and the Shoah, and so on. As the responsible body for initiating European treaties and conventions, the Council of Europe has played a considerable role in combating anti-Semitism in its various forms over the years. Amongst recent initiatives has been the additional protocol to the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, which requires signatory states to criminalise acts of a racist and xenophobic nature committed through computer systems. And by the end of January of this year, 33, actually by June, so I checked after June, by June of this year, 33 states only, out of some 60 or so states had signed the additional protocol, but only 20 had actually ratified it and entered it into the domestic legislation. Although not strictly a European agency, the Task Force for International Cooperation on Holocaust Education, the ITF, which originated in the Stockholm International Forum on the Holocaust, convened by the then Swedish Prime Minister in January 2000, requires member states to strengthen education to promote Holocaust education, remembrance and research, and to commemorate the Shoah on a particular day, and it's usually January the 27th, the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Assessing the effectiveness of the European agencies, which is really what I was asked to look at, requires a longer perspective than 20 minutes affords me. But it's worth making a couple of points. The ODIHR, the OSCE's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, energetically pursues governments and civil society data, civil society organisations for hate crime data, including on anti-Semitism. And its annual report provides an overview of these efforts and those of the other international agencies. It's divided into thematic sections and country reports and is drafted by the staff based on reports sent in by member states and by NGOs. The OSCE has also appointed a personal representative, the chairman in office, on anti-Semitism, and the current holder of that position is Rabbi Andrew Baker. Prior to him, it was Gerd Weisskirchen, a member of the Bundestag and vice president of the OSCE Parliamentary Association. ODIHR has also published a series of books on Shoah, on anti-Semitism and contemporary racism, written together with the Anne Frank Foundation in Amsterdam, and the T-shirt guide written for them by Yad Vashem. A third focus is on training criminal justice agencies to understand, investigate and prosecute hate crime. As first responders to crime, the police have to be able to determine if a crime is motivated by bias and to investigate it accordingly. The OSCE initiative, the original one, the Law Enforcement Officers Programme, has now been broadened into a wider programme, training against hate crimes for law enforcement. I won't give you all the acronyms, but there is an acronym for each of these. And the idea is to provide continuous and holistic training, not just for police officers, but for prosecutors as well. No point in training the police to investigate a hate crime if the prosecution body or the judiciary don't recognise it, don't understand, and have not prepared for it. It shortly published a guide for prosecuting hate crime, written with the assistance of the International Association of Prosecutors. As I noted before, FRA publishes an annual report on anti-Semitic crimes, similar to that of ODIHR, but it gives a long historical opening chapter as well. The overriding concern of both ODIHR and FRA since they began publishing these reports has been the lack of reliable data. European governments are required to submit data on all hate crime according to various instruments and agreements. The data must be capable of disaggregation so that anti-Semitic incidents and crimes can be isolated. But the reality is that only 13 out of 27 EU member states collected such data on anti-Semitism, and only 20 out of 56 member states collected, OSCE states did so in 2011. The reasons for doing so, or failing to do so rather, are various, and not necessarily due to lack of interest or sympathy. They may lack the capacity, they may not have legislated to give the competent authorities the mandate to do so. However, it's a very important state of affairs. You cannot analyse anti-Semitism within the areas covered by these international agencies unless you've got the data. And although governments are required, in the case of the EU member states by convention, to provide the data, they're failing to do so. It's a really poor show, and it's something that the Jewish NGOs have to start to work on.
Tel Aviv can also always make it.
Yeah, it's not the same. It's not the same. And I'll give you, and I'll go into some of the reasons if I've got time. Frustrated by the lack of official data, both agencies now encourage civil society organisations within those member states to fill the gaps and to provide context. However, many of the reports provided by civil society organisations are not good enough. They're all based on media reports. Yeah. Reports have to be based, have to be written to criminal justice standards. They have to be evidence. A report on anti-Semitism which refers only to media reports and incidents is not going to be good enough. So, with that in mind, we founded the Facing Facts project, which is a consortium of 4 NGOs, our organisation, the Community Security Trust, CEGI, based in Brussels, CIDI in the Netherlands, I won't go into what that all means, and the Dutch Federation for the Integration of Homosexuality received a very, very substantial grant from the European Commission. And over the course of 2 years, we're coming to the final stage of this 2-year period. We will be training initially 20 volunteers from various NGOs from around Europe to standardise criteria and collect data and train them to hold their governments accountable to international agreements. The point is that it's the government's responsibility, it's not the responsibility of Television University to provide data. They're bound by convention to do so. They're failing to do so. Frustrated by this, the international agencies are encouraging civil society groups, but that data has to be submitted according to certain criteria and certain standards. We're getting additional help from the UK Ministry of Justice. We've taken on some trainers, professional trainers, to assist us, and we've got additional funding. The Commission tell us that if they're happy with the outcome, and we are publishing 2 books, as well as holding a workshop in London in November of this year. If they're happy with the outcome, they will give us further funding to carry on for at least another year. We're also looking for additional funding, which we think we've found, to extend it beyond the EU, because a number of NGOs have applied to join the project, but they fall outside the European Union. For example, Ukraine, Macedonia wanted, and the Jewish communities in those countries wanted to be involved. But we can't help them, they're not EU member states. Another issue preventing data collection is the lack of a common definition. And I said I'd come back to the working definition. And I won't go into the whole history of it, because we had a conference about the history 2 years ago. The point is that the working definition on anti-Semitism was never meant to be legislative. It was meant to act as guide to the NGO world and to criminal justice agencies to enable them to understand anti-Semitism better. However, it's used by the US State Department in its annual report, it's used by ODIHR, and it's about to be published at the end of this year in the hate crime manual for all British policemen, which they will have to use as their Bible for investigating and monitoring hate crime. So, without us even asking, it's moved into that sphere. FRA are also planning, and I have to be careful what I say here, they are planning to do Holocaust training for mid-level civil servants within the European Union. There is already, as many of you may know, training for policemen on understanding the Holocaust. CSD takes policemen to Auschwitz. We're not the only Jewish community that does so. School children will obviously learn about the Holocaust, but it was felt, or it has been felt, that mid-level civil servants, those particularly like to go up, don't understand the issues, particularly the universalistic lessons that we can learn from teaching the Holocaust. So there is a plan which is going to the Commission by FRA to undertake training for civil servants throughout the European Union. Let me just mention briefly, running over time, 2 recent agreements that empower European states and the agencies. The 2008 Common Framework Agreement requires all EU member states to legislate against incitement to racial and religious hatred and denial of genocide and Holocaust. Next year, the European Commission will start to examine those states which have not yet legislated it into domestic law, and the year after, I'm told, that they will begin to prosecute those states which have not yet done so. They'll take it to the European Court for Human Rights. The second agreement, again important, slightly different, it doesn't have the force of law, is the OSCE 2009 Ministerial Agreement on Combating Hate Crime, which calls on all participating states to collect and make public reliable data on hate crime, enact specific legislation to counter hate crime, enhance capacity building, ensure national and international cooperation, and a range of other things. And it's with that mandate that the Interparliamentary Coalition Against Anti-Semitism has been conducting negotiations with Facebook, Google and Twitter, which were referred to by Ronald earlier. Let me just make 3 points in conclusion. In the final assessment, the effectiveness of the international agencies is dependent on their member states. And unless and until they translate their good intentions into action, the work of the agencies is compromised and they remain much less effective than they could be. Secondly, in the current financial situation, programs are being cut, and unless there is money and it comes from the governments themselves, then the programs are not going to carry on. And thirdly, and it's a point which really only occurred to me recently, states signed these agreements and said some of them binding when they had different governments. 3 years ago, Greece had the chairmanship of the OSCE, and they were very ambitious in their plans to combat racism. But look what's happened to Greece now. Next year, Ukraine takes over the chairmanship. I'm not so sure yet, because all the diplomatic meetings that are taking place that I'm aware of, and they're not that many, have actually given me a fairly good impression. But nevertheless, we need governments to continue with the agreements made by their predecessors. These agreements are everlasting agreements unless they're renegotiated. They're not being renegotiated. They therefore still have power, and we need governments to continue the work in good faith, despite the fact that contemporary governments may disagree with the policies of their predecessors. Thank you.
Mike, thank you very much indeed for a very informative presentation and also the wonderful pace. Given the current situation. Yeah. Okay. So I would propose if you have any comments or questions related to Mike's presentation, let's do it now. Unfortunately, Mike doesn't have that much time left, so we should use it well. So,
in your last words, Mike, you had mentioned that the effectiveness of these organizations depends on the willingness of the states. Now, I'd like to ask you if you have observed in your years of monitoring these monitoring organizations and participating, if there are in the internal developments in certain countries, not only from an economic point of view, but on a more political point of view, ups and downs in their attitudes, how they refer to such organizations. For example, I have in mind Hungary. How would you relate to Hungary's effectiveness given the changes of government in the past years, or perhaps other countries that you may have observed? Well, Dina mentioned Oive concerning Ukraine. Probably the time of Yulia Tymoshenko could have been better, or whatever.
Yeah, I'll give us a couple.
Dina, would you like to
Okay.
Since we speak about diplomacy, I would like to add a note about public diplomacy, the importance of public diplomacy. I mean that when we are, of course, we are combating anti-Semitism, but we are also against Islamophobia, and we are against any sort of intolerance and xenophobia. And in the Arab world and the Muslim world, there are many Arabs and Muslims who are not advocating anti-Semitism, and we have to win them over. We have to speak and to attract their hearts and minds, win them over to our camp. And how can we do it? I think that we as Zionists, Israelis, Jews, we have to be the first to denounce any manifestation of Islamophobia. And it will be then, as somebody who's versed in Arab culture and Arabic, I'm telling you that it will be a very powerful psychological and cultural tool in this regard. Thank you.
Okay. Mike has been really for many years now a partner to and a participant to international, especially European conferences and committees, and he really knows firsthand the work. And one cannot deny that this is impressive work, because there have been all these the line of conferences, you haven't even mentioned all of them, and the outcome was definition and seminars and trainings, etc. So, and there are budgets for NGOs doing their work and education. So there is a lot of work being done, and no one who participated even in a lesser number of conferences can deny that. There is a feeling that there are like two parallel lines. One is governmental efforts, the conferences, the seminars, the organizations, etc. And the other one is the street. And the street has its own line and its own life. I thought this is where we were heading. And its own life. And the question is, do governments reach these publics? Do the government reach the right publics that are perpetrating? That are perhaps outside the reach of the government, and these are two parallel lines, and as we say in Hebrew, two parallel lines, mikabda yipageshu, which means they never meet. That's my question.
Okay. I think, Rafi, we have to distinguish between government and the civil service. Much of the work goes on at the civil service level. In other words, the participants in many of these meetings are the diplomats or the specialists sent by interior justice ministries who focus on hate crime. And there, I have never yet met an unsympathetic reception. They understand the issues, they understand their liabilities in terms of international agreements. The problem is when politicians get involved and governments change. And there I think the answer is down to civil society. It's the NGO world that holds governments to account. And that's why the annual 2-week Human Dimension meeting organised by the OSCE is so important, or it's one of the important events in their particular calendar, just as FRA holds something similar, which is a 3-4 day meeting, where NGOs get the right to express themselves and to hold governments to account. And that's so vital. And also in the OSCE terms, NGOs are given equal right to speak as governments. Unlike the United Nations, for example, where the NGO, civil society does not have the equal rights to speak, within these fora they do. And that's the opportunity. But then there's many other opportunities. I think we would not have got as far as we had not the Jewish NGOs, together with a few other human rights NGOs, worked so closely together. I remember one meeting a couple of years ago where all the Jewish NGO representatives would divide up which delegation we were going to go and lobby. And then we would come back after a couple of hours and report back, and then we'd say, right, okay, you go to Ukraine, you go to the Netherlands, and we'd go off again. We would press governments, delegations. So, there's an opportunity, and it's an opportunity which we mustn't relinquish. We have to keep holding governments to account and to the agreements they've made. And that brings me to your point. We work in coalitions. Everything works by consensus, but we work very closely with coalitions. So we go well beyond the Jewish world. There are any number of NGOs representing sectarian interests that we can work with, who are happy to work with us, and they span, you know, from Muslim groups through to LGBT groups, some national groups. We work with all of those, and we look for people, we look for partners that we can work with, and they likewise. And in fact, if you are making a statement and you want to add emphasis to it, you say, well, and this statement is agreed by, or other organisations have signed it, and you read out the list of, you know, maybe a very varied group of NGOs that support the statement that the particular NGO is making. And you know, your point, there are two important points to make, I think, in response. Firstly, that government and the international agencies, for the last, let's say, 20 years, the whole process started in the 1990s with the Oporto Conference and the Paris Conference, which established the predecessor organisation of the OSCE, have taken responsibility for the post-Shoah situation in Europe. They recognise the harm that was done, and they have sought to make amends in various different ways. That is a signal contribution to peace in Europe and to making amends to the Jewish world. Of course, there are areas where they fall short, but they've made that commitment, and they have put in place international agreements to do so. Does it translate down to the street? Well, that's really our responsibility to make sure that legislation is passed. And I mentioned various agreements which require member states to sign legislation. And if those states are not using that legislation, or if they're not using it effectively, or if their law enforcement agencies need training, then agencies recognise that. Because in the end, it's all on the streets, isn't it? It's happening on the streets. Unless the policemen are recognising that the daubing of a swastika on a synagogue is an anti-Semitic act which needs to be prosecuted, and unless the prosecution service understand that that's an aggravated crime, and unless the judiciary understand that they have the power to enhance penalties in most jurisdictions, then, you know, nothing's going to happen. So part of the work has been pushing them towards not just legislating, but to using the legislation. I'm okay for questions.
Any more? Okay, I think that's the right time for the next speaker, David Matas.